I was 49 years old when my mother stood in my bedroom doorway with my brother's duffel bag in her hands and told me I had to be out by nightfall because my brother needed stability more than I did. I had just come off a double shift at the diner. My uniform still smelled like fryer grease. My feet were swollen and my back hurt in the deep, tired way it does when your body has been working since before the sun came up. I walked through the front door expecting a shower and a bowl of cereal, and instead, I found my mother holding my brother's bag like she was presenting him with a gift. My brother Scott was leaning against the hallway wall behind her. He was 52 years old, and he had that look on his face he always got when things were going his way without him doing a single thing to earn it. Smug and soft at the same time, like a man who had never once been asked to carry his own weight and had long since stopped wondering why. My mother had already stripped my bed. My things were packed into black trash bags and stacked against the wall. She had not even waited for me to get home before she started. I asked her where I was supposed to go. She said, "You always land on your feet." She said it the way people say things they have practiced, lightly, like they are doing you a favor by not making it sound as cruel as it actually is. I stood in that doorway and looked at the room I had slept in for years, the room I had paid rent to sleep in. Scott looked back at me from the hallway and smiled. That was the moment I understood something that changed everything. I had never been a daughter in that house. I had been a convenience. And my time being convenient was over. My name is Marla Bennett. I was 49 years old at the time, and I had spent most of my adult life being the kind of person that families like mine depend on quietly while pretending they do not. I worked full-time at the diner 5 days a week, sometimes 6. I paid my mother $350 a month in rent, handed over in cash on the first of every month without being asked. I bought my own groceries, kept my space clean, and covered utility gap more than once when the gas or electric ran short, without making a point of it. Pointing things out in that house only earned you an argument and a lecture about gratitude. Scott was 52 and had been between jobs more times than I could count. Between jobs was the polite way of saying it. The accurate way was that Scott worked when it suited him, which was rarely. He had a habit of arriving with problems and leaving with money. He could make my mother cry with worry one afternoon and have her laughing at dinner the same evening without visible effort. She rewarded this cycle his entire life, and somewhere along the way she had decided his instability was something the family owed it to him to fix. The night she threw me out, I slept in my car in the parking lot behind the diner. One orange light buzzed overhead all night. I reclined the seat and pulled my diner jacket over me like a blanket. I was 49 years old, sleeping in my car. I did not cry. I stared at the ceiling of that car and made myself remember every detail of the night carefully, because I already sensed, somewhere deep and certain, that I was going to need to remember it clearly later. I repeated the details out loud, softly, into the quiet of that empty parking lot. I had paid for that room. I had paid for that house. And the night it was taken from me was the first night of something entirely different. The next morning, I went back for the rest of my things. I told myself I would be calm. I would get what was mine and leave without making anything worse. Scott was sitting in my old room shirtless, smoking at the window, like he had lived there for years. My dresser had already been moved to the garage. The mirror I had hung myself was gone, replaced by a framed high school football photo of Scott from when he was 17. He had been decent at football 35 years ago. That was the last time anyone had pointed to something he had done and called it an achievement without lying. He looked over at me when I walked in and asked if I was done dragging this out. My mother appeared in the hallway with an envelope. She told me not to make a scene. She told me she had returned part of my last rent payment as a gesture. Inside was less than half of what I had given her. The rest, she said, had gone toward the inconvenience. The inconvenience. I held the envelope without opening it all the way. I looked at Scott in the chair by my window, smoking in a room I had paid for, in a house I had helped keep running, looking at me like I was a problem that had finally been resolved. I took the envelope and left. I said nothing. There is a kind of anger that does not come out as noise. It goes inward and becomes something harder and more useful. You do not yell with it. You do not cry with it. You simply carry it quietly. Like a tool you have not yet found the right moment to use, and you keep moving forward. Walking back to my car that morning with a trash bag in each hand was the first time I felt that kind of anger. It stayed with me for 10 years. It turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I spent the next few weeks sleeping on a pull-out sofa at my cousin Darla's apartment. Darla was kind to me in the way that good people are kind when they see someone in real trouble, carefully, and without making a production out of it. She gave me towels and a drawer and a key to the front door and did not ask me too many questions. I told people I was between places. It sounded better than the truth, which was that my mother had bagged my clothes in trash sacks and handed my room to a man who had never once paid rent in his life. Being nearly 50 and sleeping on someone else's pull-out sofa is a particular kind of humiliation, not the dramatic kind that shows on your face. The quiet kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning when you hear the refrigerator hum in someone else's kitchen, and you remember that you have no kitchen of your own. I laid there many nights, staring at Darla's ceiling and taking stock of things. I was 49. I had worked steadily for over 20 years. I had never asked anyone for money I did not plan to pay back. I had covered gaps in that house that nobody knew I had covered. And I was on a pull-out sofa. Then, about 2 weeks into my stay at Darla's, my mother called. Not to apologize, not to check on me. She called to ask if I had forgotten to leave the cable login information before I left, because Scott wanted to get his sports package set back up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after she said it. Then something shifted. The part of me that had been hoping she would call with something kind stopped hoping. That door closed. And when certain doors close all the way, they stop being losses. They become directions. While I was sorting through the last of my boxes at Darla's, I found something that stopped me completely. At the bottom of the second trash bag, wrapped inside a dish towel I had owned for years, was an envelope I had never seen before. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting. My father had been gone for 7 years by then, and seeing his handwriting on an envelope addressed to me felt like being spoken to by someone who had known exactly what I would need before I knew I needed it. The envelope was sealed. The postmark was dated 2 years before he died. I sat down on the edge of Darla's pull-out sofa and held it for a minute before I opened it. Inside was a cashier's check and a single folded note. The note said, "For your next start, not your next rescue." The check was not a large amount. It was not the kind of money that solves everything. But it was enough for a deposit on a small studio apartment and a used laptop with enough life left in it to do real work on. My father had known years before I did that I was going to need a way out of that house that did not depend on the people inside it. He had left me just enough to take one clean step in a new direction. I sat there a long time with the check and the note in my hands. My father was a quiet man who never made speeches about fairness or love. He showed those things through small, deliberate acts. Leaving this envelope for me, setting it aside and addressing it to me specifically, was the clearest thing he ever said. He saw what was happening in that family. He saw who I was inside it. And before he left, he made sure I had something of my own. I put the check in my wallet and the note in the inside pocket of my jacket. I got the studio apartment at the end of that month. It was small enough that I could cross it in 8 steps, but it was mine. The key was mine. The lease had my name on it. After years of paying rent inside someone else's house, signing a lease with my own name on it felt like something I had not known I was waiting for. I kept my shifts at the diner and started looking for ways to bring in extra income on the days off. The diner owner was a woman named Patrice who had been running the place for 14 years by herself and was, by that point, completely buried in receipts, vendor invoices, and payroll records that she kept in a plastic bin under the register. One evening after closing, when I was helping her wipe down the counter, she mentioned that she could not find a tax receipt from April and had no idea what she had paid the bread supplier in March. I asked if I could look at the bin. She laughed and said I was welcome to try. I spent 3 evenings that week organizing everything in it. I made a spreadsheet on my new laptop, sorted every expense by category and date, and handed her a clear summary by Friday. She looked at it for a long time and then looked at me. She started paying me $50 a week to keep her books going forward. It was not much, but it was honest money for work I was genuinely good at. More importantly, Patrice noticed things about me that my family had never bothered to notice. She noticed I was organized. She noticed I stayed calm when things were messy. She noticed that I had a natural sense for where money was going and what it meant. 2 months later, she mentioned me to the plumber who serviced the diner's pipes. He needed the same kind of help. I said yes. That was when I first saw the shape of the life I was going to build. My mother had a version of events that bore very little resemblance to what had actually happened. In her version, I had stormed out. In her version, I had been difficult and emotional and had refused to accept that family sometimes requires sacrifice. In her version, Scott needed support, and I had chosen selfishness over solidarity, which was apparently a character flaw I had carried my whole life. I heard this version at a funeral luncheon that winter. Someone had passed in the extended family, and I attended because the person who died had been decent to me and deserved my presence. My mother was across the room talking to a cluster of relatives, and I was close enough to hear her without being part of the conversation. She said I had always been jealous of Scott's special challenges. She said it with a kind of sad patience, like she was describing a long-standing disappointment she had quietly carried for years. Special challenges. That was what she called it. Scott's special challenge was that he was 52 years old and had never held a job for more than 8 months, never paid a bill he could avoid paying, and never once looked at the people his choices affected without assuming their job was to absorb the damage and forgive him quickly. I stood there with a paper plate in my hand and listened to the relatives nod along like she was describing something true. Then my Aunt Bev, who had always been the sharpest person in any room she entered, quietly stepped away from the group and came over to me. She stood beside me and said, in a low voice, that my mother talked like I had left them. She said that was not exactly how Scott described it when he was 2 beers into an evening. I thanked Bev and went to get more coffee. But I did not forget what she said. What Bev said sent me back through my own paperwork. I had a habit, developed over years of living in a house where promises were made casually and forgotten conveniently, of keeping records. Receipts, bank statements, printed money order confirmations. Every rent payment I had made to my mother went into a folder, and I had kept that folder through every move, including the trash bags. I sat down at my small kitchen table one evening and added it all up. Over 7 years of paying $350 a month, I had given my mother a total of $29,400. I went back further than that and found additional records from the years before I had started keeping the folder as carefully, and the number grew higher. Then I looked up the public mortgage records for my mother's house. They were available through the county assessor's website, plain and simple. The mortgage balance from the year my father died had been significant. The payments over the following years had been inconsistent. There were several gaps. The years where my mother's mortgage payments had been most consistent were the exact years I had been paying rent. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Scott had spent years being described as the child who stayed, the child who kept the family together, the loyal one, the one who sacrificed. But the record was right there in black and white numbers. The mortgage that kept the roof over their heads had been supported, quietly and consistently, by the rent I paid every single month. The golden child had been living in a house that the disposable child had been quietly holding up. I had not just been paying rent. I had been funding the illusion that Scott was the one doing something worthwhile. What started as $50 a week from Patrice and a part-time arrangement with the plumber grew into something real inside of 2 years. Word traveled the way it does in small towns, where the person you trust to fix your pipes tells the person who supplies your lumber, who tells the person who owns the hardware store, Who mentions you to the contractor who's been drowning in late invoices for 3 years? I did not advertise. I did not have a website or a business card for the first 8 months. I just did the work carefully and showed up when I said I would, which turns out to be rarer than it should be. By the end of my second year in the studio apartment, I had 14 regular clients. Contractors, a small landscaping company, a woman who ran 2 food trucks, and a retired couple who owned several rental properties and had never had anyone they trusted to keep their books clean. I rented a 1-room office above a florist on the main street of town. It cost me $400 a month and smelled faintly of roses and potting soil, and it was the most professional space I had ever occupied. I bought my first blazer from a consignment store. Navy blue, slightly too large in the shoulders, but clean and serious looking. I had it tailored for $22. I wore it to every new client meeting for 2 years. There is something that happens when you build something that is entirely your own, not inherited, not borrowed, not held together by someone else's goodwill. Something built one careful decision at a time from a position of having nothing. It does not feel like revenge. It feels better than that. It feels like clarity. Like finally standing on ground that holds because you laid it yourself and you know exactly what it is made of. 3 years after the night my mother threw me out, Scott showed up at my office. He did not call ahead. He did not send a message. He simply appeared at my office door one afternoon with his hands in his pockets and that easy smile he used when he needed something and expected charm to be enough. He had gained weight since I last saw him, and he was wearing a shirt that had seen better days. But he carried himself the same way he always had, like someone who had never learned to read the mood of a room. He sat down in the chair across from my desk without being asked. He said he needed some help with a truck loan application. The bank was asking for paperwork he did not fully understand. My mother had told him I was good with papers now, as if the business I had built from nothing over 3 years was a hobby that had gotten slightly out of hand. I let him sit there. I did not say anything for a full minute. I looked at him the way you look at something you used to be afraid of, and have since learned to see clearly. He started filling the silence with more talking, which was what Scott always did when he was uncertain. He said it would not take long. He said he would pay me back when the loan came through. He said, "Come on, it's family." That word sounded different now. When you have spent years depending on that word, hungry for what it is supposed to mean, it has a pull to it. When you have built a life that does not need it to survive, the pull is gone. It is just a word. And in Scott's mouth, it had always meant the same thing. "You owe me something for being related to me." I told him I was too busy. He looked at me like no one had ever said that to him before. Maybe no one had. A year after Scott's visit, my mother called me in tears. She said the property taxes were behind. She said she did not know what to do. She said it in the voice she used when she wanted me to feel responsible for a problem she and Scott had made together without me, which was a voice I had heard many times growing up and had once found very difficult to resist. She framed it like a shared tragedy, like the house had simply encountered hard times the way weather encounters a field, without anyone being responsible for leaving the gate open. She asked me to just look things over. She said paperwork made her nervous. She said I had always been so good at these things, which was interesting because, for the entirety of my adult life, living under her roof, my being good at things had been described as uptightness or making too big a deal out of details. I listened to her for several minutes without interrupting. Then, I told her to call the county office and ask about a payment plan. I explained that county offices often had provisions for exactly this kind of situation. I gave her the name of the department. I gave her the phone number from memory because I had looked it up the week before when I first heard through a neighbor that the taxes were running behind. She went quiet for a moment. She had been expecting something different. Then she said, "You could just come over and help." I told her I had clients to attend to and wished her luck with the call. She sounded stunned when we hung up. In all the years I had been the person who stepped in, I had conditioned her to expect that I always would. Removing that expectation, was not cruel. It was the first honest thing I had ever given her. Not long after that phone call, I ran into their neighbor at the grocery store. Her name was Flo, and she had lived next door to my mother's house for over 20 years. Flo was the kind of woman who knew everything that happened on a block because she cared about people genuinely, not as gossip, but as a way of keeping track of whether the people around her were all right. We were both in the produce section when she saw me and stopped her cart. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was well. She seemed pleased by that. Then she mentioned, in a casual way that told me she did not fully realize how significant it was, that Scott had been doing a lot of talking lately. She said he had been telling people around the neighborhood that once things settled down, he was planning to sell the house after my mother passed and finally have something to show for himself. That was the phrase she used. Finally, cash in. She said it the way you repeat something you heard without thinking about what it means to the person listening. I kept my face calm. I thanked her for the update and told her it was good to see her. I waited until I was in my car in the parking lot before I sat with what she had said. My father had worked himself half blind for that house. He had paid into it for over 30 years. He had painted it and repaired it and refinanced it once in a difficult year and kept paying until it was more his than the bank's. Scott had never contributed $1 to that house's survival in his life, and he was already planning what he would do with the money when it was over. That phrase, finally cash in, stayed with me for a long time after that. 6 years after the night my mother handed my room to Scott, I was working with a new client on a complicated tax issue involving some delinquent property filings in our county. I was cross-referencing public records on the county assessor's website, which is something I did regularly for client work. Out of habit, and maybe something more than habit, I typed in my mother's address. The page loaded, and I looked at it for a long time without moving. The house was on the county delinquency list, not just slightly behind in a way that a phone call and a plan could fix. Behind in the serious, documented way that generates certified letters and redemption notices and eventually leads to an auction date. The amount owed had compounded with fees and interest into a number that Scott, on any income he had ever reported, could not have managed in a year. I sat at my desk and stared at that screen. I was not happy about it. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story where the person in my position feels some immediate satisfaction at seeing a house slide toward disaster. That was not what I felt. What I felt was something closer to a long, slow exhale, like something I had been bracing for without knowing I was bracing had finally arrived, and I could stop tensing against it. I had spent 6 years building a business, keeping careful records, learning everything though about how property and taxes and legal documents worked in this county. I had not done any of that planning for this moment. But I had done it in a way that made this moment possible. Facts had always been my territory. The county delinquency list was a public fact. And public facts, in the right hands, become something. I went to see my mother once during this period. Just once. I told myself I was going because I wanted to look her in the eye and see whether anything had changed in the years since she had thrown me out. I think part of me also wanted to find out whether I still held on to hope in some small, stubborn corner of myself that she would surprise me. She served me instant coffee in the kitchen I used to scrub on Sunday mornings before the rest of the house was awake. She had not changed the curtains. The same clock was on the wall. It was like time had continued in that house without anything actually moving forward. She told me I had turned cold and grand since making a little money. Cold and grand. That was the phrase she used. As if the business I had built through years of careful work had made me arrogant rather than simply independent, which is apparently an attitude that looks like arrogance to people who are used to you having no options. Then she said the thing I would carry with me for the rest of the conversation and for a long time after. She said the house belonged with the child who stayed. Scott was asleep on the couch in the next room at 2 in the afternoon. I could hear him breathing from where I sat. Stayed. She had used the word stayed. Nia, as if sleeping in a house you had never contributed to. Using a room you had taken from your sister. Eating food bought on a budget you had never helped maintain. Counted as some form of loyalty so deep and so committed it earned you a house. I finished my coffee. I thanked her for her time. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long while. Then I got to work. I did not make any calls that week. I did not send any messages. I did not tell anyone what I was thinking. What I did was research. I spent my evenings at my desk, reading through county property tax codes, auction procedures, bidding rules, and redemption window timelines. All of it was public information, available to anyone who took the time to look. Most people never take the time to look, which is part of why the rules seem surprising when they finally apply. I read about tax lien sales and how they worked in our state. I read about the difference between a tax deed auction and a standard foreclosure. I read about redemption periods and what the original owner could or could not do within those windows. I read about notification requirements and the specific documentation that counties were legally required to provide before a property went to auction. None of this was clever. None of it was a scheme. It was simply information that existed openly in the world, and that I was choosing to understand fully. I also did some honest accounting of my own finances. My business had been profitable for 4 years. I had been saving carefully and had not made large purchases or taken on unnecessary debt. I knew what I had. I knew what the auction would likely require. I ran the numbers in multiple ways, checking and rechecking until the picture was clear. Then I called a real estate attorney. Not for any action yet. Just to speak to someone who understood the rules at least as well as I did, and who could tell me if there was anything I had missed or misunderstood. I found one through a referral from one of my property-owning clients, which is the best way to find professionals who are actually good at what they do. I was not plotting revenge. I was simply learning the terrain. The call I did not expect came on a Tuesday evening in late winter. A nurse at the county hospital called my phone and told me my mother had fallen. She had tripped on something in the kitchen and landed badly enough to need several days of observation and some treatment for a fracture. The nurse was calm and professional, and she mentioned that my name was still listed as the responsible family contact on my mother's medical forms, which had apparently never been updated. Scott had left his phone dead. Of course he had. I drove to the hospital because I am not the kind of person who does not. Whatever had happened between my mother and me, she was an older woman who was hurt and frightened, and I was not going to let that matter more than my ability to be a decent human being. I sat beside her bed and held her hand when she reached for it. She cried. She looked smaller than I remembered, the way people sometimes do in hospital beds, and she cried and told me she was scared. She told me she had not realized how quiet the house had gotten. She told me she missed me. For 1 long hour, I sat beside her and let myself feel what I had locked away for 6 years. The grief of it, the real grief, not the anger, but the actual sadness underneath it that comes from loving a parent who never quite learned to love you back at the same level. Then visiting hours ended and I walked out to the parking lot. I stood in the cold air for a moment and breathed. I had not forgotten anything. Grief and memory do not cancel each other out. I had simply allowed myself to feel both at the same time, which is what being a full person requires. That same evening, while my mother was still admitted, Scott cornered me in the hospital cafeteria. He came in through the side door like he had timed it, which I think he had. He was carrying a manila folder, and his expression had the particular quality it got when he believed he had outmaneuvered someone. He sat down across from me without asking and placed the folder on the table between us. He said that while our mother recovered, someone needed to manage things at the house. He said it made sense for him to have the authority to handle her accounts and property while she was unable to. He said he needed me to sign as a witness on a few documents he had prepared. He said the word few in the easy passing way that people use when they hope you will not look too closely. I picked up the top document and read it. It was not a few temporary authorizations. It was a comprehensive legal instrument that would shift durable control of the house, my mother's primary bank account, and 2 additional financial accounts to Scott almost entirely. It was written in language designed to sound routine, but structured to be nearly irreversible. Someone had helped him prepare it, because Scott on his own was not capable of this level of paperwork. Whoever had helped him had done it quickly, which was why the language was sloppy in places, and the notarization section was incomplete. He had brought legal documents to a hospital cafeteria while our mother was on medication 2 floors above us. I set the paper back down on the table. Something that had still been holding on inside me, some last thread of the hope that comes from sharing blood with people, went quiet and let go. I picked up my coffee cup. I told him I was not going to sign anything. I told him to have a good evening. Then I walked out of the cafeteria and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I drove home. The next morning, I took photographs of every page in Scott's folder. Then I drove to the office of a real estate attorney named Clive Mercer, whom one of my property-owning clients had used and described as the most unimpressed man he had ever paid for advice, which was apparently a recommendation. Clive Mercer was a thin man in his early 60s with reading glasses he wore low on his nose, like they were there for his benefit and not for appearances. His office had no decorative plants. His desk had 2 stacks of folders and a coffee mug that said nothing on it. He looked at the documents I had photographed and printed, and read them from beginning to end without commenting. When he finished, he set them down and looked at me over the glasses. He told me the documents were aggressive in their scope and sloppy in their construction. He told me the timing would be relevant, given that my mother had been medicated and was under significant stress when Scott had intended to present them. He told me that the incomplete notarization made the whole package challengeable, and that no bank or county office would accept them without a proper notary on record. Then, he asked me a question that I had been turning over in my mind for several days, but had not yet said out loud to anyone. He asked whether I had any personal interest in the house if it ever came to auction or private sale. I looked at him for a moment. Saying yes felt like more than just answering a question. It felt like finally admitting something I had known for a while, but had been careful about acknowledging. Because wanting something you were once thrown out of feels complicated until you understand that it is not about returning to the past. It is about making the record accurate. I told him yes. My mother came home from the hospital, but the house did not improve. The hospital bills added pressure to an already unstable situation. Scott had no plan that I could see beyond hoping something would change without him having to change anything. The property tax balance had grown since I had first seen it on the county website. Utility shutoff notices appeared in their mailbox twice that season, which I knew because Flo mentioned it when I ran into her again. The mortgage that my father had worked 30 years to pay down was behind in a way that generated official letters. My mother started calling me more regularly. The calls cycled through the same stages. She would start with guilt, reminding me of things she had done for me when I was young, framing my childhood as a series of sacrifices she had made. When guilt did not produce results, she would move to tears, which were genuine, I believe, in the way that people genuinely feel sorrow for situations they have genuinely created. When tears did not work, she tried indignation, telling me that a daughter with any gratitude would step in. I listened to each call fully and responded the same way each time. I told her I hoped things improved. I told her I had clients to attend to. I told her the county office number again, which she had apparently still not called. Then she said, in one of the final calls of that period, that hardship had made me, and that I owed my success to the difficult life I had been given. I thought about that for a day before I concluded she was partially right. Hardship had helped shape me, but a person who causes your hardship does not get credit for what you build in spite of it. That is not how debt works. I owed the difficulty nothing, and I was not going to pay hardship rent. The house went to tax auction in year 10. The county posted the listing publicly in the standard way, which meant it appeared in the legal notices of the local paper and on the county website for the required number of days before the sale. I had been watching the listing for several months, tracking the balance, monitoring the timeline, and meeting periodically with Clive Mercer to make sure I understood exactly what the process required and what my position would be. On the morning of the auction, I dressed carefully. I wore the navy blazer, no longer the one from the consignment store, but a proper fitted one I had bought the previous year. I carried a folder with every document I needed, organized in order. I had a cashier's check in the amount I had calculated after researching comparable bids in our county for properties of similar size and tax history. Clive was beside me. He was, as always, unimpressed by everything, which is exactly what you want in a room where money and history are both on the line. Scott was there too. He was standing near the back of the room when I walked in, unshaven, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been grabbed from a hook on the way out the door. He was looking at the door to the room with the specific expression of someone who is waiting for a last-minute solution to arrive from outside. When he saw me walk in with Clive, something moved across his face. I had seen that look before. Not on Scott specifically, but on people in general. When the comfortable story they have been telling themselves runs into the actual facts of a situation, and the gap between the two becomes impossible to ignore. I found a seat and opened my folder and waited for the bidding to start. I did not win dramatically. I did not dramatically outbid anyone or make a loud statement or signal anything to Scott across the room. I bid steadily, carefully, and with more preparation than anyone else in that building. I had done my research on what the property was worth, what the outstanding obligations totaled, and what the realistic range of competitive bids would be given the property's condition and the small number of serious bidders in the room. The final number was significant. It was not small. It required me to commit the largest single amount of money I had ever placed on a single transaction. My hand did not shake when I raised it for the final bid. It occurred to me in that moment that my hand had not shaken during any difficult moment in the past several years, which was something I noticed and quietly appreciated. The bidding closed. The room went quiet for a moment, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has just been decided and the weight of it is settling over everyone present. I signed the documents at the counter with a pen I had brought myself. 10 years before, I had stood in the doorway of my own bedroom in that house with trash bags on the floor and an envelope in my hand containing half my rent money. I had been told I was disposable. I had been told I always land on my feet, which is something people say when they want to feel good about putting you somewhere hard. I had landed on my feet, and then I had walked steadily forward for 10 years until I was standing in a fluorescent county room that smelled like old paper and a copier running somewhere in the back, holding a signed transfer document with my name on it. Justice does not always arrive looking impressive. Sometimes it arrives looking like paperwork, which is exactly what it was. The county notice was sent before I ever had to tell them myself. My mother called the same day it arrived. I let the phone ring the first time. Then I called her back, because I am not the kind of person who disappears when a difficult conversation is due. She was screaming when she answered. Not the crying kind of upset, but the full, airless kind that comes when someone has just discovered that a situation they believed was under control was never under control at all. She said I had stolen her home. She said it twice, and then a third time, as if repeating it would make it accurate. Stolen. From a woman who had put my clothes in trash bags and handed my room to a man who had never paid $1 toward the house's survival. Stolen was an interesting choice of word. Scott got on the line after her. His voice was not screaming. It was the controlled, angry voice he used when he knew he was wrong, but had decided volume and confidence might still accomplish something. He told me I was sick. He told me I was bitter. He told me I had spent 10 years obsessed with making them pay. Then he asked if I would be willing to work something out. That phrase, work something out, is specific language. It is the language of someone who has just discovered that consequences are real and is now in the early stage of negotiating how much of those consequences they can still avoid. I had heard variations of that phrase, many times in my business life, usually from clients who had let things go too far for too long and were hoping a calm conversation could undo a year of poor decisions. I told him I would have my attorney reach out with some options. I kept my voice even and professional. Then I sat in my office chair for a long while after I hung up. I did not remove them from the house immediately. I want to be specific about that because there is a version of this story where the protagonist throws the villains out without mercy, and the audience feels the satisfying snap of that moment. That was not the choice I made, and not because I lacked the legal standing to make it. I had every right to move quickly. I chose not to, for specific reasons. Throwing my mother onto the street would have made me the subject of every story Scott told for the rest of his life. The cruel daughter. The one who had money and used it to punish family. I had spent 10 years building a reputation in my town and in my professional community on being fair, careful, and precise. I was not going to compromise that reputation for the satisfaction of a fast ending. Through Clive, I offered them a formal short-term occupancy agreement. 60 days. Modest rent at a rate I had calculated to be reasonable for the size and condition of the property. Standard terms, no property modification, no subletting, a clear end date. My mother's response, delivered through a message passed along by Scott, was that she was insulted to be asked to pay rent in her own house. Her own house. That phrase had been used several times over the past 2 weeks, and it landed differently each time, because it was not her house anymore. That was the factual reality, that phrases like her own house could not change, no matter how many times they were repeated. Scott refused to sign the agreement entirely, which meant the clock ran faster. Without a signed occupancy agreement, their continued presence in the property after my ownership transfer was legally untenable in a shorter time frame than the 60 days I had offered. Sometimes refusing a fair offer is the most costly thing a person can do. I walked through the house on the final day after they had gone. I had given myself no expectations about what I would find. People leaving places they did not want to leave and did not leave graciously are not typically careful on the way out. And Scott, in particular, was not a man who had ever distinguished between what was his and what belonged to the situation he happened to be occupying at any given moment. He had taken some fixtures, light fixtures he had apparently decided were worth something, pulled from the ceiling and packed without care for the holes left behind. He had taken a small cabinet from the hallway that had belonged to my father, which I noted for the record and let go. He had left several garbage bags in the garage, tied loosely and arranged in a way that suggested he wanted me to have to deal with them. I walked through each room without rushing. The kitchen was smaller than I had remembered. The living room had a water stain on the ceiling that had been there when my father was alive and had apparently never been addressed. The floor in the back hallway needed work. Then I opened the bedroom door. My old room. The room where this had all begun on the night a woman stood with a duffel bag and told me I needed to be gone by nightfall. It was a small room. That was the first thing I noticed. Standing in it as an adult with 10 years of distance, I saw how small it actually was. The same slant of afternoon light came through the window at the same angle I remembered. The floorboards were the same. I stood in that room for several minutes, not feeling triumphant exactly, feeling something more complete than triumph, settled. Like a long tension that had been held in the body for so long it had become invisible, finally releasing all at once. Some rooms stop haunting you the moment the key in the lock is yours. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you know what it feels like to have your voice taken away by someone who smiled while they did it, then you already know why Brooke's story matters. This is the kind of story we tell here. Real stakes, real consequences, real people who refuse to fold. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because the stories coming are even more powerful than this one, and you don't want to be the last person to hear them. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? And what part of Brooke's story hit you the hardest? Share this with someone who needs to hear that staying quiet can be the most powerful move you make. and that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. We'll see you in the next one. I did not move into that house. Some people assumed I would. When they found out I had not, they seemed to feel the story was missing its final piece. But it did not need me living there to be complete. That house was about a record being corrected. Once a record is corrected, you do not have to frame it on the wall and stare at it every morning. You simply know it is accurate, and you go forward. I spent 8 months renovating the property. I hired a contractor I trusted, one of my oldest clients who did careful work at a fair price. We fixed the ceiling stain and the hallway floor, and the places where Scott had pulled fixtures from the walls without thought. I painted it a clean, warm color, updated the kitchen, and had the garden cleared. When it was done, it looked better than it had at any point in my memory. I sold it that fall to a young couple who had been renting in town for 3 years. Unable to find something decent they could afford, I gave them a fair price. They sent me a handwritten note 2 weeks after closing to say thank you. With the profit, I bought a duplex. One side for me. The other I rented to a single mother finishing nursing school at a rate that allowed her to stay without choosing between rent and textbooks. My mother called one final time. She said I had broken the family. I told her the family broke the night she put my clothes in trash bags and handed my room to my brother. I had not broken anything. I had simply been the first person in that family to learn how to read a deed. Learning to read a deed, it turns out, is one of the most useful things a person can do when they come from a family that trades in feelings and ignores paperwork. Then I wished her well, and I meant it, and I went back to work.